In this video, we're going to be talking about one of the most important openings in chess, and that is the so-called Queen's Gambit. The video is going to consist of two parts. Very briefly at the start, we're going to talk about why the Queen's Gambit is such a logical opening, why so many people play it, and then we're going to talk about the three major pathways that the game can go down based on what Black can reply. So let's dive in. The Queen's Gambit starts after the moves d4, d5, and now we play this move pawn to c4. With this move, we're actually allowing Black to win a pawn, at least temporarily, and hence the name Queen's Gambit. Now, in order to understand why the Queen's Gambit is the most popular opening in 1d4 positions, we need to understand the importance of the center in chess. Because the center is so important, if Black captures this pawn, White is allowed to build up a pawn center. And even if White plays a move like pawn to e3, White still has a better control of the central files. The reason for this is that by attracting Black's pawn to the c file, White ends up with two pawns on the central e and d files, whereas Black only has one. So really, in order to understand the Queen's Gambit, all we need to understand is that it's an attack on the center, and it's saying, I will give one pawn to my opponent temporarily. Hopefully, I will then recapture that pawn, and in the end, I'll emerge with a better grip on the center. And we can actually see that these ideas are relevant in other variations and not just when Black captures the pawn. For example, let's say that Black makes a common beginner's mistake of knight to f6. By playing in this way, White can now capture this pawn, and we can see that after knight takes pawn, we once again have established a 2 versus 1 advantage in the center. In addition to this, the reason why this move is really not very good is because White can play e4, so not only do we have the center, but we're pushing back Black's knight, moving that knight around, and in so doing, we're actually gaining time. So we have central advantage and time advantage, which are two of the core advantages that we try to grab straight out of the opening. But even if Black decides, you know what, I'm not going to play like this, but instead defend the pawn, then in these situations, after an eventual capture of this pawn, we are still going to emerge with two pawns versus one. And well, in the video later on, we will discuss positions like these ones in more depth. So that's it really. That's all that you need to know in order to understand why the Queen's Gambit has become very popular. The logic of it is to make a push for the center from the get-go. Now, let's dive into a breakdown of Black's three most common replies against the Queen's Gambit and see how we should play against each one of them. Okay, so we're back at the starting position of the Queen's Gambit, and there are three major replies. They're the most popular replies. They're considered the most serious replies. They're not the only replies. For example, one move that I want to let you guys know we won't be covering in this video is the move knight to c6. This is the so-called Slav Defense, and it's a tricky move. At some point, you will need to learn this move, but for now, we're going to be talking about three options. The first one is if Black captures the pawn. This move is imaginatively called the Queen's Gambit accepted. And Black can, instead of playing this move, play the move pawn to e6 instead. And this is the so-called Queen's Gambit declined, right? So in one case, Black accepts the pawn. In the other, Black declines the pawn. Now, there is another way in which Black can decline the gambit, and that is with the move pawn to c6. And this is the so-called Slav Defense. So between these three moves, that covers about 80-85% of the total responses that Black can actually play against you. In other words, if you play 100 games, you can expect that about 85 of them will be one of these three moves. So it has you pretty well covered. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about is what to do against this pawn capture. Now, the most aggressive continuation is probably the move pawn to e4. Why is it the most aggressive? Well, it is the most ambitious in the sense that it grabs full control of the center. Of course, if White had another move, White would capture this pawn and be incredibly happy. A brilliant center, a recovery of the pawn. But there is a catch to playing in this way. And the catch is that when you put the pawns out so ambitiously, Black can actually start to strike at these pawns with moves like knight f6 or knight c6, and the pawns are not very well defended, and that's not to mention the possibility of e5 or c5 looking to gambit a pawn back, leveraging the fact that, hey, you know, black is up a pawn, so they can afford to be a little bit more creative, let's say, with their pawn pushing. Now, because of all of this, I don't think it's such a beginner-friendly approach to the Queen's Gambit. So we're going to play in a different way. In this position, I recommend the move pawn to e3. Now, after pawn to e3, we are threatening to recover the pawn, and we will have a nice advantage with that 2 pawns in the center. We can later on look to push with e4 once we're more ready. So this more conservative approach is usually met by a move like knight to f6, black develops. But first of all, we should understand what happens if black tries to defend the pawn. As you can see, there's a question mark, which is the computer telling you this is not a good move. But why is it not a good move? Well, the key thing to remember here is the move pawn to a4. In this way, we're trying to break down this pawn structure. And we have a really lovely benefit of tactics in this position, where the tactics are simply favoring us. If black, for example, tries to defend with a6, we can win this pawn. And if black tries to recapture, well, they actually lose this rook on a8. So this is a common trap. Every once in a while, you'll catch out an opponent in exactly this fashion. So it'll be an easy win. But a less easy win, but still pretty easy, is this move pawn to c6. Now, pawn to c6, this is actually a beautiful thing that you want to see, because when you see this move, you'll win almost all your games near instantly. The reason for this is because black is signaling their intention to recapture this pawn, right? So they want pawn takes, and now they just want to recapture. And they're saying, you know, I'll hang on to the pawn. And they do hang on to the pawn, but after queen f3, unfortunately for them, they're actually losing this rook. Well, it's not technically true that they're losing the rook, because they can save the rook by sacrificing the knight on c6. But after queen takes knight, well, black can play something like bishop d7, and you will just retreat with the queen, and you're up a full piece. Well, maybe a piece for a pawn, but certainly completely winning. So this is one of the most important traps, and one of the reasons I think that as a beginner or early intermediate player, it makes a lot of sense to play e3. Not only are you more conservative in the center, but also if black tries to defend the pawn, then you often catch them out. Notice if you had put the pawn on e4, the queen f3 idea would simply not exist. So how should black actually... So this begs the question, how should black actually continue? Well, we had said that in this position here after e3, black normally just plays knight to f6. And after bishop takes c4, what they do is they play e6. Now you might be asking yourself, why would they play e6 and voluntarily lock in this bishop? Well, that's a great question. It turns out that the old variation was actually this move bishop to f5. But what people started to realize is that after white plays natural moves like knight c3, knight f3, castle, maybe queen e2 or rook e1, natural development, at some point later on, white can play the move e4 and target that bishop with a gain of space. And so for this reason, black started to realize that this is not the best setup. So don't worry if they put the bishop out there, just develop naturally and eventually play for e4, gaining time against their bishop. So what they realized instead is that they should play e6. And what they will do with their bishop is that they will eventually look to expand on the queen side and place the bishop on the long diagonal. Now, if you're playing an experienced player, how they will actually kick things off from here is they'll play the move pawn to c5. The reason behind this move is that because white has a 2 versus 1 pawn advantage in the center, black wants to try to say, you know, hey, I gave you that advantage early on by capturing here, exchanging my d pawn for your c pawn, but now the tables have turned. I'm looking to exchange my c pawn for your d pawn and level the playing field, so to speak. So that is the best way to play. But I should say to you, I will show you that most beginner players, and I took a look at this in the online chess database, so this is not, you know, an opinion or anecdotal, but actually statistical, most beginner chess players will play the move bishop to e7. And this is a bad move. Why is it a bad move? Because we are allowed to keep our center unchallenged. So what we do is we just develop normally, we play knight out to c3, and again, black should still look for that c5 to challenge our center, but oftentimes they're scared to do so, so they play b6, now we can build up that center. So an important lesson to remember is do not be afraid to move the pawn just because you only moved it one square instead of two earlier on. Circumstances have changed here because now you are castled, your king is safe, and your pieces are beautifully developed. So now is a good time to expand in the center. Now, black plays the move bishop to b7, targeting this pawn here with two pieces, and we can see how quickly black gets into trouble. Queen e2, just defending the pawn, knight d7, and e5. So this is a nice thing to understand, that we're often going to be looking for this e5 move if they allow us. The knight now is forced between some really poor choice of squares. The reason why it's a poor choice is because this one here is going back to the first rank. That's a terrible idea. And from there, if you picture the knight there, it has no forward jumps. Here or here, it's too vulnerable to attacks from our pieces. And so really, they only have this square as a kind of decent option. But now we move on to the world of pawn structures. We can actually take here, and as a result of a series of exchanges, we get a favorable structural change. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the pawn structure has actually changed. If you look back here, we can see black had 3 pawns on the queen side, and then 4 pawns here on the king side. And white, well, we had a kind of a similar situation where we had 3 on the queen side, and then 4 here on the king side. So we had a 4 versus 4 on the king side. But notice, once this happens, we now have a situation where we are left with 4 versus 3 on the king side. That's really dangerous for black, because eventually in the future, we can look to move this knight and push this pawn up and create serious problems for the black king. So that's a topic for to cover in depth in another video. Let me know if you'd like me to cover pawn structures. I think it's a really important topic in chess. But yeah, for now, we'll just say that this 4 versus 3 is good for white. So we can see that if black doesn't challenge our center, they get into serious trouble very quickly. Okay, so this has all started with this wrong approach from beginners where they play the move bishop to e7. The best move instead is pawn to c5, targeting our center. And what should we do here? Well, we simply castle. Black continues with a6. Remember that plan we had mentioned of b5 and developing the bishop onto that long diagonal from h1 to a8. Now we capture this pawn. Now there's many different possibilities, but I think if you're a beginner, this is the way to play. Because in my opinion, if you start playing some other move like queen e2, it's very easy to start to get into a bad position here where black has more space on the queen side, your center is no longer so powerful, and, well, black's pieces are just quite aggressively posted. In fact, look at black's bishop, and the other bishop is going to be very nice here, whereas look at yours trapped behind this pawn on e3. So if you're a beginner, what I recommend to do is against a6, just capture the pawn on c5 before they can execute this whole plan. Now, black typically takes the queen because otherwise you can take the queen and they can no longer castle. So they typically take the queen, rook takes, and bishop takes c5. You get a position that is pretty equalish because of the fact that the pawn structure is the same. The pieces are similarly placed, but we have a slight edge because we have one better developed piece. And our approach here should be to put some pressure on the queen side because of our better development. So I like to start with the move here, bishop to e2. And the idea is that at some point I'll move the knight forward to e5 and I'll put the bishop on f3. So let's say, for example, that black castles. I can start by developing, and then maybe black develops. And at some point I'm looking for this move like knight to e5. And then let's say that black tries to develop with a move like knight to c6. Well, in this position, black would already be in a lot of trouble because we can capture here. And after knight takes knight, we can go knight to b3. And with knight to b3, we target the knight here on d7. And if black defends the knight, we can actually capture it because of our second threat, which is rook takes. And now that knight was actually the defender of the bishop. So we can now win 2 pieces for a rook, and we're going to have a Actually, objectively speaking, this is already a winning position. Of course, in practice, anything can happen, but we certainly got out of the opening really well. So you can see that there is a little bit more danger there for black than there is for white. Now, of course, black doesn't need to fall for this. Black can play, a natural move like knight c6, maybe stopping that knight e5 ideas. But in this instance, we can play in a couple of ways. One way is we can play a3, looking for b4, and then looking to just develop our bishop to b2. It's not a huge advantage for white, but it is a slight advantage, and it's a safe position. So this is what I would recommend to do if your opponent knows their stuff. So with that, we've actually covered the entire Queen's Gambit accepted variation, which leaves two more variations, the Queen's Gambit declined and the Slav. So let's check out the Queen's Gambit declined. Now, the Queen's Gambit declined begins with the move pawn to e6. This is a position that has been played at the World Championship level, so there's a lot of theory around it. But as beginners, this is what I would recommend that you play. I would recommend you play knight to c3, and after knight to f6, you play the main line chosen by master level players, which is to capture this pawn on d5. Now, most of the time, black will want to keep a decent control of the center, so they'll recapture with the e pawn. And we need to understand, why did we do this? Why did we give up the c pawn? And by capturing here and allowing black to replace it with the e pawn, it's in effect, why did we exchange this pawn for this pawn, right? If you look at the starting position and you were to now remove these two pawns, we can see that's exactly the position that we have. So why would we do that? Change a pawn that was a little bit more advanced, a little bit stronger, for a pawn that was not only less strong than ours, but also at the same time we helped them to potentially develop that bishop. It doesn't seem to make sense, but it has to do with the establishment of the two pawns versus one majority on the central files, which we talked about at the start of the video. And so this is actually the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, and it's extremely popular because white has enduring advantage because of this particular pawn structure. This pawn structure, by the way, is one of the most important in chess. It's known as the Carlsbad pawn structure. So if you've ever heard the word Carlsbad used, maybe you were wondering why. This is the reason. This particular position is the most common way in which you reach this Carlsbad structure. Not the only way, but it's a structure where white has a 2 and 5 pawn chain versus a 4 and 3 pawn chain. If you're wondering, by the way, why it's called the Carlsbad pawn structure, it has to do with an old tournament, very strong tournament in 1922 in Carlsbad, then Czechoslovakia, where this particular opening system was employed a lot. So anyway, moving back to the game, pawn takes, and white here plays bishop to g5. So one of the ideas is that now after bishop g5, bishop e7, we are now playing e3, but we've made sure to take the time to develop that bishop so it doesn't remain a bad piece. Now black castles, white again develops, and black plays a move like pawn to c6. Now, the important thing to remember about this structure is that you do have that pawn majority, so you want to use that. So we will show how you would use that. You would begin with a move like queen to c2, just setting up a nice queen-bishop battery, looking to capture this knight and win this pawn on h7 if black is not careful. Now, if black is careful, they'll play a move like h6, and now we keep our bishop. We don't want to just give them what's called the bishop pair by leaving them with the two bishops on the board and we only have one. So we don't want that. They continue their development. We continue our development. And you might be saying, why is this knight going to e2 when it could be going to f3? And of course you could play f3, but this move that I suggest you play has to do with trying to make the most of our 2 versus 1 pawn advantage in the center. So why is that? Well, after rook e8, we castle, and after the move knight f8, I'm just showing not the only moves for black, but the kind of best plan. Black is just looking to bring some more firepower to the king side, and also their development is a bit limited by their pawn structure, right? The knight cannot go to c6. So black develops the knight, and now we play this move pawn to f3. And the idea with this is we're finally looking to mobilize, to move forward with our pawn advantage in the center. So that is why we played knight to e2. So after f3, black can develop with bishop e6. I like to throw in a move like rook to d1 just to fortify the central files. And after rook d1, rook c8, one final preparatory move I recommend is the move king to h1. So this is the rough outline of the plan that you should be going for. Now you're in the middle game and you are prepared to play the move pawn to e4. The reason why king h1 is useful is because if we play pawn to e4 immediately, we might just land into a little bit of trouble along this diagonal. So if we're going to move our pawns and soften up that diagonal, remember, we used to have pawns here on f2 and e3, and now, well, they're gone and they're gone. So if you're going to do that, it's just useful to have the king parked safely on h1. So that is the setup that you're going for. And honestly, it's a setup that I think will do very, very well against beginner level players, because most of the time, black is not even going to know how to play the best way against it, as we have actually shown in this example. Most of the time, black will be making a mistaken plan earlier on and give you even more chances than if you reach this position. So that covers the Queen's Gambit declined, and that leaves us with only one path left, maybe the most complicated to play against if you're a beginner player, and that is the so-called Slav defense. So let's check that out now. Okay, so here the Slav begins with the move pawn to c6. Now in this instance, what black is saying is, you know what, I don't want this 2 versus 1 pawn majority. I don't want to deal with any of those problems. So now if you, for example, take, which many players do, it's the so-called exchange variation of the Slav, well, now we have this position where, because I've been able to recapture with the c pawn, now you do not have a 2 versus 1 majority. In fact, we have complete symmetry. And it's this symmetry, this likeness of the position, that actually makes the exchange variation of the Slav one of the most drawish positions at high-level chess that you can get. It has something like a 90% draw rate. And when many people do exchange there, they're just telling you, you know what, I'm not feeling that ambitious. You know, maybe I want an easy game, or maybe I have a little bit too much respect for you and I just want to reduce risk as much as possible. So we can play in this way. And it's an easier way to play as a beginner, but I'm not going to recommend it because it's very drawish. So what should we do against the Slav? Well, here what I decided to recommend is the move knight to f3. Now, in this way, we kind of, one of the reasons I like to play in this way is that if you go knight to c3, here black can actually take this pawn on c4, and it's okay for white, but it gets a little bit messy. Let's say you go e4 and black starts to defend this pawn with b5. These positions get a little bit messy and it's not so easy for us to recover our pawn. Part of the reason why is if we start trying to hack away at these pawns, then when black goes b4, that knight is under fire and, you know, we have to move it again. So even if we recover the pawn, we've spent a lot of time moving our knight around. So it's for this reason that I recommend to develop the knight on f3 first. So after knight to f3, if now black were to capture this pawn, we're way better prepared. This is a bad idea for them. We will go pawn to e3. Now black tries to hang on to the pawn with b5, and we go pawn to a4, an idea that is quite familiar perhaps from the first variation where we saw this a4 and trying to undermine these pawns. Now after a4, black can try to hang on to the pawn for dear life, but after we capture here, they have to take back with the c pawn. Remember, if they take with the a pawn, they lose this rook. So they have to take back with the c pawn, and now we play the move pawn to b3. By doing this, we're once again undermining this pawn structure, but you might be wondering, well, can they not simply take this pawn here? And now we're just down another pawn, and yeah, it's true, we can recover this pawn, but we're still down one pawn. Well, in this case, we have another trick up our sleeve, which is we play the move bishop takes b5 check. So we ignore the pawn on b3 for now. We're still down a pawn, but the point is they cannot take this bishop without losing the rook. So most players here, they go for bishop to d7, and now we simply can exchange, and queen takes b3. In the end, we've recovered our pawn, and our position is much, much better than black's, because while black was trying to hang on to their pawn without success, they ended up making a lot of weakening moves on the queen side. Now this pawn is an easy target, while look at our control of the center. and our healthy piece development. Look, on the other hand, at black's pieces on the king side, they still have a long way to go before castling, while we can actually just castle on the next move. So this is a very big advantage for white. So this is the reason why I like to play knight to f3. You get a situation where you say to black, you can take my pawn, but I'm going to recover it in the best circumstances. So after knight f3, what black should be doing is ignoring the pawn and continuing their own development. After knight f6, we now develop our knight to c3. Now, again, this is a tricky situation. What do we do? Because we could, for example, play the move pawn to e3, and in this way make sure that if they capture our pawn, we can recover it. But the problem with this is that we limit the possibilities of developing this bishop. In some instances, we may wish to do exactly that. So that's why I don't really like e3, and instead we'll play knight c3. And it's true that in this position now, black can actually recover the pawn. But before we talk about this position, I want to introduce you to an alternative that is extremely popular, and it's this move pawn to e6. This is known as the semi-Slav. Now, it's a strange looking move to play e6 and voluntarily keep your bishop out of the pawn chain. But once again, black's idea is to at some point move the b pawn and develop the bishop onto the long diagonal there on b7. So it's for this reason that black is comfortable locking the bishop inside of the central diagonals, let's say, due to their pawn chain. So after e6, how should we play here? Well, you have the option of playing the move bishop to g5, but I really don't recommend this for beginners because after h6, you're facing a tough choice. You face the possibility of giving black the bishop pair, which in my opinion lets them get a very nice middle game, or you can play the more popular move at the Grandmaster level of bishop to h4, but this leads to chaos. After black captures this pawn, white will go e4, black will go g5, or rather first b5, defend the pawn, and then after e5, black will go g5. So if you think this is a beginner-friendly position, then more power to you. But even myself, I've been a 1d4 player for many, many years, and even this position just gives me a headache. So I don't recommend to play like this as a beginner or even an intermediate player. So because of this, we're going to play a little bit more quietly, and we're going to play e3. Now, against e3, black will develop, we can develop, black develops, and we can just quietly develop our pieces, bringing them to the best squares. And the idea is that at some point we'll play b3, and we'll just get that bishop out onto b2. So you might end up with a similar-ish position to your opponent like this, with castle, queen e7, and black is looking at some c5 ideas and some e5 ideas. In the meantime, what is our own plan? Well, we are simply bringing all of our pieces to the most natural squares and waiting for black to be the one to strike. Why is black going to be the one to strike? Well, because if black does nothing, sooner or later we can advance with e4. So if black wants to try to have a proper fight in the middle game, what they need to do is they need to contest our better pawn center. So they will play the move pawn to c5. But once they play like this, we can exchange on d5, pawn takes d5, and we can just calmly play a move like bishop to f1 and continue to wait. And the idea, once again, boils down to pawn structures. The idea is that in this position, if black just does absolutely nothing, let's say something like rook e8, we can actually just play g3. Let's say black plays a move like h6. We can just play bishop g2. And we can get this very comfortable position, very safe position, and all the time be threatening the possibility at the right moment to capture on c5 and open up lines of attack against this pawn here on d5. Black, in these instances, will often go wrong. For example, they might play c4 to try and avoid that idea, but now this allows you to take, and to start grabbing a big hold of the center here with e4. So this would be very, very bad for black. I should show, by the way, that if black wins this pawn here, we can just move this knight to h4, killing off f5 ideas, because that way we can capture it. And the point of knight h4 is that we open up one more piece to target the knight on e4, and the knight can't move because of the pin here against the queen. So because of these factors, black would actually end up down a piece. You might be thinking, wait a second, can black not play a move like knight f6? But we have even more firepower to bring crashing down on this knight on e4. So it's for this reason that black can get into very, very fast trouble if they play a move like pawn to c4. But sometimes they don't want to deal with this, so they play pawn to d4, pawn takes d4. But again here, that brings our knight to d4, and black is left with what's known as an IQP, an isolated queen's pawn. So this position is once again very nice for white. Not only do we have a lot of long-term pressure on the pawn, but we can also put the knight out to f5. So with this, we've talked about the so-called semi-Slav. You have to be patient against it, but if you're patient, you do have a little bit of an edge because of your better central control. So what happens if instead of the semi-Slav here with the move pawn to e6, what happens if black captures the pawn on c4? Well, in this instance, black's idea is to play the move b5. Now, you could just continue with a move like e4, let them play b5, but I don't really like that. I don't like going down one pawn and trying to, claim that I have enough of an edge in the center to make up for it. So instead, I like to just kill off those ideas. Play a4. Now, black takes the opportunity while you're playing a4 to develop their bishop out to f5. In this instance, it just wouldn't be good for black to play a move like e6, because now we grab the center, and let's say black were to play a move like this, bishop takes c4, and you can see this bishop is in trouble. And unlike in other variations where we talked about how black might play b5 and a quick bishop b7, that's not an option here because we have a clamp on the b5 square. So if your opponent plays this way, you can get a huge advantage straight out of the opening. Okay, so what black normally does is they develop the bishop out to f5, and now I'm going to recommend this move knight h4. Sorry, that move just, lashed onto the screen there. But the idea behind this move, knight to h4, is it's not actually the most popular, but the most popular way to play is something like e3 or something like knight e5. Both moves looking to recover that pawn straight away. But just as an example of how messy the game gets and how not beginner friendly it can become, after a move like knight to e5, let's say that white sometimes plays something like e6, f3, or black rather, bishop to b4. In these positions, the theory says you should play e4, and the theory for black says the best move is bishop takes e4. And now after pawn takes e4, knight takes e4. So black is down a piece, but has a lot of pawns for it and has huge pressure on this knight. And again, I just don't think that this is a good idea if you're earlier to the game, earlier to your adventures in the Queen's Gambit. So because of this, I want to go in a different direction and recommend the move knight to h4. By playing in this way, black's bishop is immediately targeted, and most of the time, what black will do is bishop to g6. If they go elsewhere, let's say they go bishop g4, we can just hunt that bishop down. We go h3, we go g4, not afraid of any weakening of the king side because that bishop is a very valuable target. We finally have won the bishop, and by winning that bishop that was controlling the square like e4, now we can build up that strong pawn center. So black can continue with a move like e6, and we can win this pawn. And we have a really good position because our position is not so unsafe here. At the end of the day, the pawn here on e4 is still defended, while one other tactic we need to worry about is this, and knight takes g4 because we cannot take this way because of the rook. But if knight takes g4, we have queen takes g4. So everything is okay. And so if black plays something calm, like slow, like bishop e7, we can actually be really, really happy here, bringing our bishop out. But the best move here to play is to actually just go king f1, looking to plant the king on g2, and that way be very, very safe. Because if you were to castle, you would lose this pawn on h3. So we just aim for the g2 square with our king, and life is pretty good here for white. The only small problem is that this pawn can lead to some weaknesses, but if you know what you're doing, then everything is under control. So because of this, black normally actually doesn't go for any of this, and normally instead plays bishop to g6. So after bishop to g6, we can just win the bishop. This time we haven't even had to worry about pushing these pawns up too far up the board. And now we grab the center with e4. Now, what black normally does here, what they probably should be doing is trying to undermine that pawn center. And then, things can get a little bit more tricky, a little bit more messy. For example, we have some ideas like we capture this pawn on c4, we let them capture, then we can push the pawn on e5, and the position gets a little bit messy here. The idea, however, is that if, let's say, black wins this knight on c3, we win on the spot with bishop takes f7 check. Why does this win on the spot? Well, if king takes f7, we simply win the queen, while if king to e7, then we play pawn takes. Black has to take with the pawn, otherwise they lose control of the queen. And now we go queen b3, and we have this beautiful threat of checkmate. So materialist level, but we're threatening mate on e6, and we're threatening to capture on b7. Nevertheless, I would recommend that you check out this position a little bit more in your own time if you wish, which is if black goes for e5 and just sort of goes for the throat and forces you to play some messy tactical positions. But most of the time, what black players will actually do is they'll just go e6. And in this position, we can calmly recover our pawn, and now our position is fantastic. We have a beautiful pawn center, we have very well placed pieces, and really the only thing that black can try and do is undermine our pawn center by pinning this knight so that it creates the threat of capturing the pawn on e4. But we have an easy defense to that. I like the move queen to d3, just covering both of these pawns now. And after queen d3, black can continue to develop, we'll develop. Black often will go queen to c7, just putting some pressure on this pawn. So just make sure you don't allow yourself to get checkmated there absent-mindedly. Just play a move like h3. And in the end, the opening phase is complete. We have a beautiful pawn center and, well, much better chances in the middle game than our opponent. So that is the Queen's Gambit. We've seen the Queen's Gambit accepted, where we recommended the quiet e3 move, but it's poisonous. There are many tactics available there for white. We then took a look at the Queen's Gambit declined, where the main idea there was the so-called Carlsbad pawn structure, a very important pawn structure in chess to understand why it's considered to be an advantage for white. And it all boiled down to central control in both of these cases. In this particular variation, the so-called Slav, I think that's the biggest challenge, because black says, no, I don't want you to have a better central control straight away. So they fight for that. But in the end, we see that in some variations, like in this one, you will still often end up with better central control after all. So in all of the cases, I think there's a slight edge. Of course, if the black player knows what they're doing, it is fairly close to equality across the main and most respected lines. But nevertheless, the Queen's Gambit is a great opening, in my opinion, to have in your arsenal at every level. So I hope that this particular video has been helpful to you, has been helpful in building up your understanding and giving you some ideas of what to do if you do choose to play the Queen's Gambit. Let me know if you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if you like the level at which this video is aimed at. Would you like it to be a little bit simpler? Would you like something more in depth? I'd love to hear about you guys, because sometimes I'm a little bit in the dark as to the exact level. So I'm trying to see how it all goes with this particular video, a little bit aimed more at beginners. So hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.